When they go to confront the kid turns and runs. The kid actually can be heard on the officer's body cam saying he had a gun, and he does reach for his waistband. The officers end up shooting him. The kid lived. He did not have a real gun. People don't think about the psychological impact on those officers for having had to use that force. Instead of your pay now, pay later analogy, I steal from the tactical world. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast.
San Diego 911 emergency. You need to come right away. There's a man with a gun and it's loaded. Receiving emergency signal from 4 George 1141. We've got a white female down. We need paramedics close. All available units roll code that
way. Welcome to the De-Escalation Conversations podcast. This week we have a really great guest. The subject is navigating autism behaviors, and this is told from two perspectives. One, a law enforcement officer, and two, the dad of an autistic child. Doc Davis, what a great guy he is. He has a PhD in psychology, and what's interesting is his focus is on hostage negotiation, crisis intervention, stress, and autism. And he was Doc Davis before he was a PhD doctor, because he was in the Navy as a corpsman and served healing Marines. He worked with a Marine unit. He served 4 years in the military and 20 years in law enforcement. He retired from the Boynton Beach, Florida Police Department as a sergeant, and he was in charge of their crime prevention unit. Additionally, he also served as team commander for both the hostage negotiation and critical incident stress management teams. He's also taught undergraduate college courses for a number of years before deciding to focus on law enforcement communities' training needs. You can find him on LinkedIn. We'll also have his other contact information in the show notes. And I interviewed Doc at the ILEETA conference in 2023 in St. Louis, Missouri. One of my top 2 favorite conferences to go to every year. If you're a law enforcement trainer and you're not familiar with ILEETA, the International Law Enforcement Educators and Trainers Association, I'll put the link for their website in the show notes. You absolutely have to check ILEETA out. I've been teaching for ILEETA at their conferences for about 7 years now, and I usually do at least 2 classes, sometimes as many as 4 like I did this year. And every single one of them, I learn as much from the participants as the participants might learn from me. So definitely check out ILEETA, check out Doc Davis, and certainly, of course, listen to this podcast episode, because he is going to share some information and it's just going to tug at your heartstrings. It's great information to keep you safe, no matter whether you're a K through 12 educator, a first responder, or a flight attendant, because we all know there's no cover at 37,000 feet. Enjoy the show. Welcome to the De-Escalation Conversation podcast. I am here with just really quite an amazing guy, Doc Davis. And we'll talk about where Doc came from, because he's like Doc squared. I'll explain that one, so hang with me for that. Doc Davis is an amazing man. You just heard the intro that I gave about him, and what we're going to be doing for the next little bit is talking about the specialty areas, because he has several, that he shares with officers information on that literally it saves lives and it makes people's lives better. Doc, welcome to the show.
I appreciate you having me, Carrie.
So one of the first questions I ask folks is, what was the path? What was the journey to lead you to where we are sitting here today?
I wasn't doing well in school. Ended up going into the military, which kind of really straightened out a lot of the issues I was having as a confused young individual. Ended up as a Navy corpsman with Marine infantry, which is, as you kind of alluded to, where Doc started. Being a combat medic with Marine infantry, I kind of lost my original name and just became Doc. When I got out of the military, I went into law enforcement. My first cop job was in a small little city called Salisbury, Maryland. got really tired of being cold. So I moved to South Florida, started working at an agency called Boynton Beach in Palm Beach County. Was there for 15 years, and along the way, started realizing there was a need to have a plan for life after law enforcement. Went back to school, had a lot of really good influences, ended up doing my PhD in psychology, hence the Dr. Doc, D squared. I'm glad to say you didn't say I was a square. Thank you. But again, as I was going through school, my second son was born. And by the time he was about 18 months old, we realized that he wasn't developing normally. A lot of doctor's visits, a lot of testing later, we finally got the diagnosis that my son was autistic. And that really kind of hyper-focused me on the world of autism. I had already been exposed to it, running a hostage negotiation team. I had always tried to find the best ways to round out my negotiators' experience. So I had introduced them to autism and had autistic individuals come in and speak to my team so that they could get a greater understanding of interacting with that segment of society. But then when it hit home, it really kind of pushed me to another level with that.
I bet. And how old is your son today?
My son is now 12.
And I'm going to tell you that even as much as I know about autism, I'm still pretty ignorant about the entire subject. If there was a percentage of population that is on the spectrum, do you have any idea what that number might look like?
Approximately 2% of the population is diagnosed with autism.
Okay.
We're talking over, we're in the millions of individuals just in this country. And autism is the fastest growing developmental disorder, not just in the US, but also in the world.
So the likelihood of one of our listeners, who they're everybody from school teachers to law enforcement, first responders, firefighters, people in medical services, flight attendants, having an encounter with somebody who's on the spectrum is pretty likely.
Absolutely. One of the numbers that would actually probably mean more than that percentage number is the current diagnostic rate. The CDC in 2018 increased the number. They now consider that 1 out of every 44 children will be diagnosed with autism or be on the spectrum due to a specific genetic discrepancy. There are 4 boys for every 1 girl diagnosed. So for boys, it's like 1 in 22 to 1 in 24 boys will be diagnosed.
Which really puts it in perspective, because when you say 2%, it would be natural to think, okay, 2%, that's not that much. But when you say 1 in 22, or even just 1 in 44, you're like, okay, that is, I mean, that's a big number, really.
Yeah.
So,
and that number actually, sorry to cut you, that number actually is a little misleading, because there is actually National Institute of Health surveys that go back prior to that, as far as 2016, that suggested the number in 2016 was actually 1 in 40. And it's not that it got to a lesser point 2 years later, it's just a difference in methodologies used. The CDC won't endorse the higher percentage or the higher rate of occurrence that the NIH survey came up with because of the methodology used in that survey. So really 1 in 44 is undercounting what's going on. And what a lot of people don't stop to think about is that autistic children become autistic adults. This is not something that people grow out of as they get older.
so if I'm a school teacher, and I know a lot of schools have the benefit of IEPs, individual educational plans. And, you know, oftentimes before a school teacher has interaction with the child, they are, they're diagnosed, and there's some preparatory ability there. for a school teacher or even a parent in particular, is there any, if you had to say there's 3 key things you could do, and I'm blindsiding you with this because we didn't talk about this before. Is there 3 things or 2 things or 1 thing that you can do to help make just your consistent day-to-day interactions go better with the child, talking about child
Right.
first?
Again, it's difficult to say because when we talk about the autism spectrum, you have to realize how broad of a topic we're breaching here. When the American Psychological Association released the DSM-5 in 2013, they actually eliminated 4 of the named disorders. So most of your listeners will probably have heard the term Asperger's syndrome.
Mhm.
That was removed from the DSM. It's not there anymore. Since the DSM-5 came out in 2013, they removed Asperger's syndrome, they removed pervasive developmental disorder, they removed childhood disintegrative disorder, and they removed Rett syndrome. Those 4 are no longer there. Everything is now just considered autism spectrum disorder level 1, 2, or 3. And it's a very linear way to think about it. And there's some pushes to change that, but that's a topic for another day. That linear model, at one end, you have an individual in a wheelchair, pretty much incapable of even basic life-sustaining self-care. At the other end of the spectrum, you have Elon Musk, Daryl Hannah, Dan Aykroyd. Those 3 individuals have come out and publicly acknowledged their autism diagnosis. There are other very famous individuals out in the world that have either publicly acknowledged or continue to try to keep their medical situation private, to each their own. Dr. Temple Grandin completely revolutionized the beef industry, both in the United States and Australia. Asperger's, very phenomenal woman. But so again, it's such a broad area. It's hard to put in place 3 simple rules. One of the things I will say is that a lot of autistic individuals find comfort in routine and familiarity. Number 2, they will develop their own methods for attempting to self-calm, and some of them look harmful. And obviously, we never want to allow an individual to self-harm, but we have to, especially on the law enforcement side, recognize the difference between a behavior that is designed to harm the self versus one that may be harmful, but is an attempt to calm. And that's where a lot of the different state statutes on involuntary psychological evaluations come in.
Yeah, and I definitely want to dive into that. So you gave 2 things. What would a third be, if you can?
Patience. It is going to take endless amounts of patience. When I'm teaching law enforcement, I always try to get them to comprehend the frustration this way. In movies, you'll sometimes see where somebody goes to sleep in one place and they wake up and they've been moved somewhere else. Like in Can You See Me Now Part 2, where they all of a sudden wake up and they're in the Far East. Imagine if you woke up tomorrow in a country that doesn't speak English and you don't speak the local language. How frustrated would you get when you know exactly what you're trying to say? You know exactly what your wants and needs are, but nobody around you can understand what you're saying. They're not getting it. You're delivering the message in a way that's perfectly clear to you, but nobody else can understand. Think about that. There's a young lady who graduated from Rollins College in Florida this past year. Her name is Elizabeth Bonkers. She's out on YouTube, wonderful video. She gives the valedictorian speech for her graduating class. And her autism is such that she is completely nonverbal. She typed her valedictorian speech using the old-fashioned one-finger hunt and peck on a keyboard. She's also at a point where she actually needs help to get dressed, but that's no indication of the intellect locked inside her head. And listening to her speech is really kind of eye-opening and enlightening for how, she talks about being locked in this silent cage. And learning to type was the only thing that finally gave her that window of communication with the outside world, where people could begin to recognize the actual intellect that was there. Apparently, she says that when her high school principal found out that she was graduating valedictorian, he apparently was quoted as saying, "The retard can't be valedictorian."
Wow.
A lot of
That's the only
misunderstanding in the
response
world.
I have for that. Wow.
Yeah, there's a lot of misunderstanding in the world.
Yeah.
And it's key to understand that autistic people, it's not that there's something wrong, it's just that there's something different.
Well, I think your analogy of waking up in a country where you cannot communicate with anybody else because you're doing it just fine and they don't understand you. I think that's a really powerful framework to use for people to be able to, when they're frustrated, take a step back from that frustration and go, okay, maybe I'm the person who's not listening well enough.
Well, and again, I don't want it to sound like it's getting into an issue of fault. It's not about fault, but it is important to always view, the empathy that we talk about constantly. It's always important to try to see things from the other person's perspective. Just because you're right doesn't necessarily mean I'm wrong. And it works the other way around. So it becomes very important to try to understand the world from that person's point of view.
Very cool. Very cool. So if a law enforcement officer encounters a person that seems to be acting differently, now, let's go back to this number 2 thing that you mentioned, the self-comforting actions that might look like they're harming themselves, might be misinterpreted, not just for law enforcement officers, but for anybody. Can you give me some examples and give our listeners some examples of what that might look like?
Well, it's not always just the issue of harm. I'll answer it directly and then I'll get into the rest of that. Unfortunately, what we call self-injury behaviors, SIBs, are a frequent issue in the world of autism. My son's 12 years old. He is very self-aggressive. He punches himself pretty much everywhere. He currently has 2 black eyes. His left cheek is puffy and swollen. He has bruises in multiple stages of healing on both outer arms where he punches himself in the arms, his thighs. At 4.5, I have no idea what he did. I was coming in from outside and he had cut the back of his right arm open. So at 4.5, he had 14 stitches put in the back of his right arm. A few years later, he fell and ended up getting 5 staples in his head. So it's kind of a miracle that I haven't been the subject of a DCF investigation yet.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Like, how do you go to an ER and explain, oh yeah, my kid did that to himself?
I've been extremely fortunate in that the region I'm in, the doctors are aware of autism and they understand. But I'll be honest with you, my paranoia regarding an officer or a social worker not understanding is to the point that my internal house security cameras are as much for documentation of how my son got injured as they are for somebody breaking in.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when your son is hitting himself, if this is not too personal, is that part of that self-comforting, or is it frustration? Do you have any idea? Does anybody know?
It can be all of the above. Autistic individuals engage in what's called stimming, self-stimulating behavior. And I stole this analogy from another instructor in South Florida, but he talks about you go to the grocery store and you're walking up to get into the 10 item or less line, and you get that one person who speed walks to get in front of you. And you're like, okay. And you look and their cart is full. And you're like, 10 items or less, full cart. Mm-hmm.
And they cut me off.
Yeah. So you're sitting there and, you're starting to, your hands are like ringing the shopping cart, almost like, you're like the reverse revving a motorcycle, and you're sitting there and they put all that crap up on the belt. And of course the employee doesn't care. So now you get even more frustrated and you start talking to yourself, that little bit of a hum going on, and you maybe like starting to pace side to side between the candy and the magazines. And then they whip out the coupons and then the checkbook. And by now you are dramatically bouncing and ringing. And all of it is an attempt to keep yourself from going up there and choking the living daylights out of this person who so clearly deserves it. That's what self-stimulating behavior is. Physical motion designed to help calm the mind. But in autism, it might be much more pronounced. The humming is going to be very loud as we're talking now or louder. The movements, you'll see the tonic-clonic arm movements, you'll see hand flapping, full body rocking. All of this is, again, physical motion designed to help calm the mind. So when you take that to an extreme, you look at, one of my son's things is he punches himself in the face. And that is a very extreme version of that stimming. He can literally be sitting there watching a video and 1, 2, 3, and then he'll stop. And watching the video and there we go again, and then stop. So, but it can also be frustration. So, you can sometimes see the frustration in the face, the tension in the, so it can be both. Now, obviously, with the self-injury behaviors, we try to block that behavior. We try to redirect that behavior. We try to find ways to help them find a more healthy outlet for that energy. But he's quick.
Apparently.
He's very
Can you put him in like one of those red men suits? If you don't know what a red man suit is, it's what used for defensive tactics. It's like full body padding. Put him in a red man suit. I don't know.
I've thought about putting me in one of those.
Well, that was actually going to be my next comment, is that how often does this stimming turn to another person? And is there any correlation between frustration, or is it just a random thing? And again, that third disclaimer, does anybody even know?
Well, this now gets into the realm of what's called a meltdown. And everybody's familiar with children throwing temper tantrums. A meltdown from the outside looks identical to a temper tantrum. The difference is what's going on inside the brain. We know through years of experience and training that you cannot stop a seizure. If somebody's having a seizure, the best thing we can do is we don't try to restrain them. We try to get everything out of the way so that while they're having, especially the grand mal seizures, we try to get everything out of the way so that they don't hurt themselves during the seizure.
Yeah, protect the head and watch the show.
An autistic individual having a meltdown has as much control over the meltdown as the seizure patient has over the seizure. Effectively, think about it as an electrical storm in the brain that then causes the behaviors. So if they're flailing and lashing, and my son was having one, it was the middle of the night. I had to be up early the next morning to drive 2 hours to conduct a class. And all I could do was it was the middle of the night. He's thrashing in his bed. All I could do was just crawl in behind him and essentially body lock him to try and prevent him from hurting himself so I could just fall back asleep. And he threw his head back and caught me dead center in my right eye with the back of his head. So I'm now teaching crisis intervention with a black eye. It lends immediate credibility to the instructor when you do that.
No kidding.
So, but again, there was no intent.
Right.
It wasn't something he could control. So when officers are walking into these situations, we look at, he gave me a black eye. He did headbutt me. Was there intent? He has bruises in multiple stages of healing. Is it abuse? And this becomes extremely important for law enforcement because we can't just dismiss it, because estimates are 1/3 of special needs children are physically abused. So we have to be very careful. We've been taught that multiple bruises, multiple stages of healing, especially in different areas, this is the classic indicator of child abuse, but it may not be. But at the same time, it could
It
be.
might be.
So we have to be very careful with that.
So what do you do with that? If you've got somebody, I mean, you're brilliant enough to have in-home security cameras. You are foresightful enough, part of that brilliance, to say, yeah, I might get broken into, but at the same time, this is going to keep me from getting prosecuted because I can prove I didn't harm my son.
Right.
What about somebody who just hasn't listened to this podcast until today, hasn't thought of that, can't afford it, doesn't have, for whatever reason, they don't do it. And an officer rolls up because a neighbor, some person was walking by and heard some screaming and yelling, thrashing around. And so, oh, I'm going to call because they're abusing that child. What advice can you give the officer, the neighbor who is walking by, who goes, and there's something odd going on in that house? That kid's got bruises and a black eye.
Yeah.
What advice could you give to that first responder, that individual who sees something happening at a home, in a parking lot? Because obviously you go places with your son, and certain incidents have happened out in public. What do you do with that?
For the first responders, the key is going to be slow down. And I teach this in all my crisis classes, my negotiation classes, my autism classes. We have to slow down. I don't care how much your sergeant, lieutenant, captain, major god, whoever, I don't care how much they're yelling at you. You can only handle one call at a time. And if you slow down and handle that call properly from the outset, you will end up using less time than if you push it and escalate it and make a mistake.
So it's like those old, I think it was Shell gas stations had this commercial way back when. It was pay me now or pay me later, and they were encouraging people to get the oil changes in their cars.
Yeah.
You either pay the price up front, get the oil change and protect your engine, or you're going to have to pay later for a new engine or a new car because your engine didn't last as long as it could. So in this case, paying me now, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm going to throw that concept out. Pay me now keeps us from having a lawsuit later, potentially, or
goes
court
beyond
or
that.
anything else.
Lawsuit, prosecution, you end up getting into an escalated situation where we have a use of force. Salt Lake City got a call to respond to an autistic individual. The mother reported the kid was highly upset, and she said he had a gun, but she didn't think it was real. And the officer said, well, how do you know it's not real? She goes, well, I don't, but I don't think it's real. And they tell her, well, then we have to treat it as if it's real. When they go to confront the kid turns and runs. The kid actually can be heard on the officer's body cam saying he had a gun, and he does reach for his waistband. The officers end up shooting him. The kid lived. He did not have a real gun. People don't think about the psychological impact on those officers for having had to use that force. Instead of your pay now, pay later analogy, I steal from the tactical world. Slow is smooth. Smooth is fast.
I love that saying. So let's shift gears just a little bit. I want to put the spotlight back on you.
Oh, God.
So RD2 Consulting. Tell me about that.
RD2, the name has kind of evolved. It started off as Raines, Davis, and Davis. There were three of us. My one partner, Troy Raines, is moved out of Florida. He's now a homicide detective in Aurora, Colorado. The other Davis was my sister, Rita Davis. She's retired and moved up to the Carolinas. And it kind of is now me, my first initial R, Doc Davis. So RD2. It
Still
evolved over time.
Still
Yeah.
works.
It was a very fortunate thing that it kept working.
And you've mentioned some of the trainings that you do. Tell me, what's kind of the cafeteria menu that we can choose from?
My primary areas of focus with the, the doctoral research and everything has always been within the fields of hostage negotiation, crisis intervention, and then obviously I added on the autism bit with the personal experience. I don't teach the Memphis model per se, meaning I'm not affiliated with NAMI, but the information that I do teach comes directly out of the recommended elements within the Memphis model. So when they created the Memphis model, they wrote an article called The Core Elements. It's a 20-page document. Less than 1.5 pages talk about that 40 hours of training. I took that 1.5 pages, and that's where the foundation for my 40-hour crisis class came from. But I also take it from the perspective of a negotiator. I truly believe that crisis intervention is the single player version of the hostage or crisis negotiation team sport. And it's something that cops do every day, at home, at work. Everything is communication, interpersonal communication skills. It's foundational to everything we do in life, being able to communicate and understand people.
If you were to give a couple of tips on communication in general, not just focused on autism, but in general for hostage negotiation, for crisis intervention, anything like that, what's kind of your 1, 2, or 3 main go-tos for that?
Listen more, speak less. It is much more important in any interaction to be a good listener than a good speaker. A lot of people, when they think about negotiators, they think, oh my God, this guy could sell ice to Eskimos in snowstorms. That's great, but it's more important to let the other person get their story out. It's important to understand how they got to where they are and why they're in that situation. A lot of times you may be the first person to ever let that other individual have that moment. And that can be extremely powerful. It always, for me, comes back to the stairway model. Use your active listening, display empathy. But as you know, Nicole Florisi has got out there, we need to be careful with empathy because there is a dark side to it. But it is important to understand where people are coming from, how they're viewing the situation in which they found themselves. By using those tools, we build rapport. Rapport gets us to trust. Once we have the person's trust, then we can start to influence their thinking, influence their decision-making, and ultimately change their behavior.
Yeah, and that's the only way to have influence on somebody is to get that trust established.
Absolutely.
You know, one of the things that I always say is everybody in this world has an addiction, and that addiction is to be understood. And when you can demonstrate to the other person that you understand them, that is the biggest puzzle piece in that trust.
It's
equation.
powerful. It's absolutely powerful.
There was something that you had mentioned earlier about I'm going to shift back over to autism for just a moment. You had mentioned to me something about an infinity loop, or there was some symbol that you mentioned.
Well, I actually brought you this today. It is the autism coin that I've had made up. And most people, when they think about icons regarding autism, they think of the blue puzzle piece. Yeah. And that was the device that was created by Autism Speaks. It's a great organization. It's predominantly clinicians and family members of autistic individuals. Now, when we think about puzzle pieces, we always kind of think about that one piece that's either missing or doesn't quite fit. And some members of the autistic community are kind of offended by that because that line of thinking would seem to indicate that something is wrong with an individual.
Yeah. Okay.
And they don't believe there's anything wrong with them. They're different, the same way you're different from me. So they instead chose the rainbow infinity symbol, which is the symbol for neurodiversity. Okay. Over time, that evolved and they changed it to the gold infinity infinity, the abbreviated symbol on the periodic table of elements for gold being AU, which is the beginning of the word autism.
That's pretty darn cool.
Hey, smarter people than me.
Here's somebody who knew their table of elements. I forgot that after 7th grade.
Yeah, it didn't seem relevant after that. But again, so this is the coin I had made, and I want you to have that one.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate that. And then I'll put a picture up there for the listeners that are watching this on video. And if you're listening to this podcast, you can shift over to either the Facebook group or to YouTube. And I'll show you a close-up of this. But on the left-hand side, it says starting the conversation. On the right-hand side, it says awareness. And I love both of those. That's pretty darn cool. And then over here, it has acceptance, different, not wrong on the right-hand side. And then, of course, Doc Davis, autism awareness in the lettering. That's cool. And then this is the infinity loop, the multicolored infinity loop you talked about before.
Right, and had that completely made up of puzzle pieces to kind of begin that conversation, as it says, starting the conversation about the puzzle piece versus the infinity loop.
That is so freaking cool. I'm honored by the gift. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
So first of all, as we begin to wrap things up, what would you say is the best way that our listeners can follow what you're doing, have a, where can they go to find out more about you, about your training, how to connect with you if they're interested in having this type of training brought to them?
Right. Again, my website is rd2consultingllc.com. I will admit to not being as current on that as I should be, but I do get around to it eventually. I'm on Facebook as Florida Negotiator and LinkedIn as Doc Davis. So I try to update content on that about where I'm going to be and different articles that I end up putting out.
That's awesome. So in the listeners, in the show notes, I'll have links for all of those things. And that RD2 is RD and the number 2?
Correct.
Okay. So RD2 LLC.
RD2 Consulting
LLC. Okay. Well, listeners, look in the show notes. Don't listen to me because I'm an idiot. And in the show notes, the correct links will be in there so you can get a hold of Doc Davis. Doc, any last closing thoughts before we close up? That anything in particular that our listeners need to know about hostage negotiation, crisis intervention, autism, your 3 areas of specialty?
For those of you who do have autistic family members, be aware of the community resources. They're there. There are national resources. There are community-based resources in every state. If you have the space for it, where you're putting those links at the end of this, I can give you some of the national resources where people can link out and look for additional help. The autism community is usually very open and accepting and willing to provide help to other people so that they can, again, learn some of the lessons that other people have learned along the way. There is help, there are resources.
Well, it's a big job being a parent, period. And having a child on the spectrum adds, quite frankly, it just adds an extra layer where you need to be able to show that care and compassion and reach beyond your normal abilities. I have no doubt that your patience muscle got a lot bigger through the last few years.
Not as big as I wish it had made it to, but yeah, it has grown dramatically.
Well, one of my other favorite phrases is progress, not perfection.
Semper Avante.
So thank you for your time.
Absolutely.
Thank you
Thanks
being
for having
here.
me.
I appreciate it. And we're in a conference room at ILEETA, the International Law Enforcement Educators Trainers Association in St. Louis. It's the annual conference in March, always around St. Patrick's Day. And Doc is here to not only learn from other people, but also to deliver material. He's just an amazing instructor with amazing skill sets. I call it the trifecta that you have. And being able to come to ILEETA for a week of having, we have around, I know we packed 700 bags this year for attendees. And so being able to have that number of instructors be able to come together, be able to learn from each other, pick up skills, interact, pick up on new things during the expo with vendors, it's an amazing opportunity. ILEETA pays me nothing to say these amazing things, but I'm a big supporter and believer in ILEETA, and I have been for a number of years. I think with the exception of the year they were shut down for COVID, for lockdown, I've been here 7 years and presented at least 1 to this time 4 classes every year. ILEETA is an amazing organization, and I'm glad that you're a member of it because we connected through ILEETA ultimately.
Absolutely.
And again, thanks for being here. To our listeners, tell your friends, let them know about the amazing Doc Davis and all the different things that he can share with them to make their lives better, safer, easier, and allow them to serve their communities better and serve their families at a very high level. As always, until next time, stay safe. I hope you found a lot of great value in this episode of the De-Escalation Conversations podcast. Please be sure to go to our website, theidea.world, THEIDEA.world. On that website, just click on the link that resonates with you most. If you're a K through 12 educator, if you're a firefighter, medical services, law enforcement, flight attendants, whatever industry you're in, we have specialized training for you. So check that training out because literally it can save your life, it can save your relationship, it can save your career. So check out theidea.world. I'll look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.